Order. Welcome to the Northern Ireland Affairs Select Committee, first hearing on the funding and delivery of public services in Northern Ireland. So I'd like to welcome our witnesses today. Could you please introduce yourselves and say what your position is? We'll start with Stephen.
Okay, I'm Stephen Farry with the Ulster University Strategic Policy Unit as co-director. And I should declare I was previously an MP, for those who aren't aware of that. And I'm in the unusual position that I gave evidence to this committee prior to becoming an MP. I sat on the committee and then I'm giving evidence after the fact, so I've done the full Nyack sandwich.
It's great to have you back.
Thank you very much. Sure.
Dorinnia.
Good morning. My name is Dorinnia Carville and I'm the Comptroller and Auditor General for Northern Ireland.
And I'm Robert Chote and I'm Chair of the Northern Ireland Fiscal Council.
Okay, well, thank you very much. My first question goes to Ms Carville. In your view, what is the state of public services in Northern Ireland?
Okay. There's no doubt that there are significant challenges facing the public sector in Northern Ireland. I've been in post now for just over 2.5 years, and certainly during the course of my work I've reported on a lot of areas facing challenge. Most notably probably in the health sector. We've published reports around waiting lists, access to mental health services, access to general practice. But more widely than that, I've had recent reports looking at the schools estate, looking at child poverty and the ability to deliver on major capital infrastructure projects. And I think it's fair to say that in those reports that we've published, it's not a particularly positive read. The outcomes that are desired in those areas aren't being achieved, and the services aren't meeting the standards that have been set for those services. The reasons for this, you'll appreciate, differ in the subject area, but there are some commonality of the reasons why public services are struggling. Funding has had a significant impact across all of the work that we have done. The health sector in particular will cite workforce pressures in particular in that sector, and we have seen quite widely an impact where skills, we don't have the required skills in all areas, and we saw that quite significantly in major capital projects and the ability to deliver there. Due to these pressures then, departments they're concentrating on, and have been for the last couple of years, really delivering their statutory services. They're firefighting, if you like, and that has really impacted on the pace of change and transformation. There's been a real lack of focus on preventative measures, on early intervention, on trying to achieve longer term cost savings, if you like. And it would be remiss of me not to mention the lack of ministers for the period when the Assembly wasn't there. Definitely did have an impact as well. And public servants were working in a very difficult environment, especially those senior public service servants who were having to act sometimes in place of ministers. We obviously now have our Assembly back, which is great. And I guess if I can end on a positive, we have the scrutiny committees back. The committee that I work most closely with is the Public Accounts Committee, and what I'm seeing there with that committee is a real drive and a real pace for impact, for change, and you'll see that in the recommendations coming out of their inquiries to date. They're very time bound, they're very focused on making an impact and making changes that will benefit the citizens of Northern Ireland.
Okay, thank you. Sir Robert.
Well, as you know, the Council looks at the higher level budget and allocation there, so Dorinnia's may be able to go into it in more detail. I think a couple of points I'd pick up and emphasise is, one clear piece of evidence of the pressures facing public services has been the fact that there has been overspending of the available funding, so departments have found it hard to keep within the available funding that they've had. And that reflects a number of factors. Obviously, some of the pressures, as you've described, around health and need for preventative work, etc. But as Dorinnia said, the parcel of responsibility for the budget of going from an executive through to caretaker ministers, then through the Secretary of State, then back to the Stormont institutions again, is clearly not an environment conducive to everybody being able to sort of plan and reform public services and take long-term transformational decisions. I mean, one of the difficulties both with the caretaker period and with the period with the NIO in charge is that, you know, they didn't feel that they had the political or in some cases legal authority to take big substantive decisions, and that's contributing to some of the broader difficulties. Now, obviously, in some respects, the difficulties are common to the UK as a whole. So the impact of inflation, pay pressures is not something that's unique to Northern Ireland, but combining that with the particular challenges of the squeeze on the Barnett formula and the pass-the-parcel control of budgets has not made life any easier.
Thank you. Professor Farry.
Thank you very much, Chair. And I suppose to put this in context, if we look at the news headlines, both in Northern Ireland and the UK as a whole at the moment, I mean, it's dominated by the crisis in the health service. But I think it's important to understand that the magnitude of what we're talking about in Northern Ireland compared to Great Britain is enormous. So even in terms of waiting lists, where in some situations it's now over a year in England, and that rightly is getting considerable pushback. For some conditions, you're talking 4 or 5 years in Northern Ireland. So the sheer scale of the crisis is that much greater. I would also say that it's important to widen out the term public service as well. And we don't just focus in terms of health, education, etc., in that more narrow sense, but look at things like the economy and our ability to invest in those type of improvements, whether it's skills and infrastructure, to ensure that Northern Ireland remains fully competitive in that particular respect. We should also reflect on that across a lot of indicators in Northern Ireland is performing worse than virtually every other part of the UK. Like economic inactivity is one that's usually cited, where the figure is somewhere around 26-27%, and that has been a very sticky problem over many decades and hasn't really shifted in any meaningful way. Looking forward, I think there's two things as well to be very conscious around in terms of potential risks. A lot of the additional money, which we'll come to talk about later on, that's now available to the Executive, has arisen from Barnett consequentials from additional spending decisions taken here in London. That will obviously have a boost in terms of the quality and outcomes of public services. The danger in Northern Ireland is that money is simply sucked up in terms of balancing the books. So this situation of almost running to standstill is further embedded, but we actually then end up with those gaps widening further. And I think the other thing we need to be very mindful of is the potential risk of almost a two-speed public services emerging. And the one in mind I would have is in terms of health, where we end up in a situation where, due to waiting lists, we see more and more people opting out of the National Health Service route and going private. Obviously, those who have money are able to afford that option. So we end up then with a two-tier situation where those who are on lower incomes are more deeply affected by the public spending pressures, and that builds in a sense of inequality in society. Now, I'm not aware that that's been quantified in recent times, but it may be something just to keep an eye on.
Yeah, okay. Thank you very much. Gavin.
Thank you very much, Chair, and good morning to you all. First question, I suppose, is a general one in which public services are most in need of improvement, and whether you can even quantify that or narrow it down. Dorinnia, maybe from your experience, you might be able to talk to us about it in the past where you've seen the greatest deficit in the ability to deliver public services.
Yeah. So obviously with my work, I don't look so much at the funding allocation process, and Professor Robert can probably talk more to that. But in terms of what I have seen in my work to date, thinking across all of the government departments, I would have to say that I can't think of one department that has ever said to me in the last couple of years, my funding is adequate or my funding is sufficient. But there certainly are certain departments where the struggles, if you like, have become more acute, and we have seen those. And there's probably two departments that come to mind in particular. The first being the Department for Infrastructure, who certainly in my time in office have repeatedly felt, and we have reported on it in the past as well, that they start the year with a baseline budget that is not met, and that has been compounding over many years. We did a report a number of years back around the structural maintenance of our roads that actually just really drew out the fact that that particular department year after year was starting under their budget need. They were relying on in-year monitoring, really impacts on their ability to plan longer term projects. A big part of that department, they're dealing with day-to-day work, but for large infrastructure project that needs long-term sustainable funding, and that department wasn't getting it. Now Sir Robert might wish to pick up in the current process, and I know DFI have maybe fared relatively better in the proposed budget, but there has been a long-term impact of that. The other one would be health as well, because I audit all of the public bodies, the trusts in particular. When the local assembly was down and we were in the budget situation that Sir Robert outlined, they were in a budget deficit situation for a large part of the year. They have a statutory responsibility to break even in terms of the budget that they were given, and just felt from the outset that they were not going to be in a position to do that, and even cutting services still would not have facilitated them doing that. Now when the Assembly stood back up and the package that came with it, that allowed them to balance their books in that particular year, but they continue to face real pressures. And we've looked at other areas. I don't want to as I say, like every department has their pressure. When we looked at mental health services, for example, and the Public Accounts Committee looked at this, there's a 10-year strategy in place. It's largely agreed, it will make a difference, but the funding package was never there to deliver on it, so it's already behind. And there's lots of examples like that.
I mean, you started off your answer by saying that you've never had a department indicate to you that they wouldn't wish to have more money. Fair enough, understandable. Have you ever had a department indicate to you a level of defensiveness that suggests they don't have room for improvement? That they don't accept the criticism of their inability to deliver good public services? Or to put it maybe another way, in fairness to you and the role that you have, do you find yourself routinely making recommendations on a repetitive basis that are the same because lessons have not been learned about the effective delivery of public service?
Yeah, I think it would be fair to say, certainly in our role, we do end up being somewhat critical a lot of the time. I think human nature, people put up a defence to that sometimes, but we end up giving recommendations for improvement. Departments are at liberty to accept or not accept those recommendations. I would say in the main they are accepted, and I think public servants are always striving for improvement. I would have to acknowledge that and commend public servants for that. So there is always that willingness to improve. With regard to the second part of your question, Gavin, around lessons learned, unfortunately we do in the Audit Office see ourselves coming back to topics and making similar points, or actually highlighting where actions that departments have committed to achieve improvements have not been taken. One that springs to mind, I did a follow-up report last year on major capital projects, and that was a follow-up report. The office had previously looked at it 4.5 years beforehand in 2019. These are big signature infrastructure projects relating that the executive previous executive collectively said were of significant importance to Northern Ireland. Budget had been ring-fenced. They hadn't been delivered to time and to cost. Only one has been delivered to date. 4 years later, still only one has been delivered. Now, there's many issues with all of these projects, but the ability to deliver on time and on cost is a repeated problem, and the Public Accounts Committee drew that to the attention of departments back in 2019. They are in the middle of an inquiry on the follow-up, and they're actually taking evidence from the head of the civil service on that inquiry because they do see it of such significance as to how do we get this right. So there are many areas where we do come back and look at lessons learned. We did a piece on locum doctors a number of years ago as well, and patient safety, and again, repeated points in there. And the child poverty strategy, the local PAC, held an inquiry into that at a time when a new anti-poverty strategy was being drafted, and they highlighted in their report that they actually said very specifically, we are concerned that the lessons from the child poverty strategy will not be learned and the repeated mistakes might come forward in the anti-poverty strategy, and they actually formulated recommendations for the department, who are at a stage currently of drafting that strategy to bring it forward to the Minister. So it's something that we're all very attuned to, but unfortunately it is happening, Gavin.
Thank you, that's a useful example. Sir Robert, you chair the Fiscal Council in Northern Ireland, but you have an experience and a professionalism born out of knowledge in London and Whitehall and the structures here. And Dorinnia, in an earlier answer, said that there's not only deficits in funding but also in skills and in capacity. So how do you feel the Northern Ireland Civil Service and the structures that are there to deliver public services fare compared to their counterparts in England, Scotland or Wales?
I think in terms of the civil service, I would emphasise the quality and the professionalism of the individuals working in it, and that's true on both sides of the water. I mean, famously, I think you would look at the structure of the executive departments as being more siloed than is the case at Westminster. So you have, obviously, given the nature of the structure, the constitutional structure around the way in which the executive and the assembly works, you have departments with legal personality, single accounting officers, no pretense that there being collective responsibility at a ministerial level across that. So I think in particular across areas of cross-cutting work, one senses that's just harder to achieve in the Northern Ireland context than it is in the Whitehall context, which is not to say that Whitehall does it terribly well either.
Do you feel is that a structural problem within Northern Ireland, or is that a consequence of multi-party enforced coalition government?
It's obviously hard to know with a natural experiment without changing it from one way to the other, but I think clearly the way in which both the nature of the departments and their relative autonomy in Northern Ireland, plus the fact that you have the Department of Finance is less powerful most of the time than the Treasury here, and the Executive Office doesn't pretend to play the cross-cutting role really that the Cabinet Office does at the Whitehall level. Obviously, Jane and colleagues at the top of the NICS work very hard on trying to ensure that there's thinking, working and communication across the system as a whole. But those structural features, I think, you would certainly expect those to make those a difference there. But so at the margin, again, knowing how that actually feeds through to particular outcomes is hard to say. In some cases also, of course, you have departments where one or two arm's length bodies are essentially very significant spenders within the department. So NI Water within infrastructure, for example, and there is no precise equivalent to that at the UK level. So there are differences in responsibilities as well as the way in which the system is organised.
Thank you.
Well, I can pass back to you, Chair, if you like.
Thanks. Maybe anything to add?
I don't want to shun Stephen. Stephen, if you
no, that's okay.
Sorry, Stephen.
That's okay. Just very briefly, 2 points to build on things, and before that, just to say that on the legal nature of devolution in Northern Ireland is different from both Scotland and Wales, where it's devolved to a collective. In Northern Ireland, it's devolved to individual departments. So there's a different legal regime to that, which makes things somewhat difficult. The 2 points I want to make is obviously health dominates the narrative around the public service challenges at present, and Gavin will readily identify with this as well. So whenever we talk about budget debates, health is always prioritised in terms of that debate because people's lives are at stake. So in the short term immediacy, that has a greater priority than the long-term investments that people recognise are important, but they just have to keep people alive and make sure people are well. But we're not seeing that shift in terms of the debate, whereas health is seen too much as a matter for the Department of Health rather than something that is for all departments to contribute to. So what happens in terms of education, in terms of early years and investing in children is important. What happens in terms of economy and giving people jobs is important. So we're not fully having that conversation. We're seeing health too much as in a silo in that respect, and it builds then on the point around prevention. At the moment, it's too much firefighting. We're just trying to keep the services afloat rather than looking to see how things can be done better and achieve better outcomes. So we're not perhaps seeing the same shift towards prevention that's happening in other jurisdictions as a consequence of that. And one of the things that we've been identifying in the universities around this concept of preventative DEL, which is about carving out a proportion of the resource DEL, and this will be different for different departments given their particular responsibilities, but trying to ring-fence some money, which doesn't stop other expenditure on prevention happening, but at least focus minds. So I think you have Demos and Public Health England and the Institute for Government are pushing that, and I think they wrote to the Chancellor prior to the autumn budget trying to encourage that type of issue to be considered.
Yeah.
Make one small observation, is that okay?
You can, yes.
Thank you, Chair, for that indulgence. I mean, just on that point, I was sitting there listening to Sir Robert, and one thing in my mind at the minute in terms of health, you raised the issue of health. We have a situation at the minute where people are blocking, hate that word, but blocking the flow of leaving hospitals because we do not have enough people working in domiciliary care. And whenever I previously sat in the Assembly, I had raised time and time again, what are Department for Economy, for example, doing with DOH to say, we know that there is a shortage of people working in these areas. We know that there are barriers, whether it be private insurance for cars, whether it be issues around mileage. Would that be an example of the sort of thing that you're talking about, where you're saying that health is getting the lion's share by far and away of the block grant, but actually there is no evidence or little evidence to say that they're working in a collaborative way with, for example, DFE on jobs and how we actually get people into those roles?
Skills as a key driver, and workforce is an issue across the board, particularly in the health service. But if you look at economic inactivity in both directions, getting people a job will reduce people's risk of health problems coming up. But at the same time, having an effective health service to address some of those long-term conditions that are keeping people out of the labour market is also crucial. So it's a joined-up issue in both directions.
Thank you. Lee?
Thank you. I'm particularly interested in the package to restore, the restoration package for Northern Ireland Executive, which included over 1.1 billion for stabilisation funding. Was this sufficient for public services, in your opinion?
As you know, the restoration package has sort of short and long-term elements to it. So there's a short-term budget support to deal with the fact that this was happening at a time when the departments were overspending against the available funding. So there are large chunks of money, about 500 each for 2023, 24 and 24, 25 into 25, 26. And then that falls away. And then you also have the advantage of the fact that there is now a top-up to future Barnett consequentials that come in as and when the UK government increases spending in England on things for which the executive is responsible in Northern Ireland. So clearly that short-term stabilisation money has been very helpful and was in some senses inescapable given the degree of overspending that there was at that stage. So as you're aware, the Council did some work suggesting, and we would put lots of caveats around this, that roughly 24% more needs to be spent per head on public services in Northern Ireland to deliver equivalent quality and quantity of services and outcomes to England. In the absence of that short-term stabilisation money, the premium would be lower than 124, with it slightly above. So one shouldn't place too much emphasis on a snapshot in one year for the financing of public services to be sustainable. It's not just the amount of the money, but the reasonable assurance that it's there on a stable basis looking forward so that people can workforce plan and do transformation, etc. So one challenge at the moment is that short-term stabilisation money runs out, thus confronting the executive with a potential cliff edge in 2026-27 when that money goes away. But the 24% top-up to the Barnett consequentials won't have been large enough to sort of fill that gap. So I think there's a particular challenge around that point. That cliff edge could, in theory, move forward to 2025-26 if the executive doesn't manage to balance the budget this year and also to meet its commitment to deliver some 113 million of additional revenue as well. So it's clearly helped in the short term. Departments are still overcommitted. They are saying that they're overspending relative to available funding. Thanks to the money that came in as a consequence of the last UK budget, that number is now much smaller and more manageable for 2024-25. But the Treasury has already signalled that it will need to think about potential flexibilities and how you smooth things through to 2026-27. So I doubt that there's a serious prospect that the cliff edge will be brought forward, but it's still a big challenge when you get to that point. So the short-term stabilisation, certainly helpful, but not on its own putting you on what looks like a sustainable pattern for 5 years ahead.
And then just as a follow-up, what would you say the impact's been of the stabilisation funding on public services and delivery?
Well, one, as I say, better that than not. One thing that it has obviously helped to address, and this will be true again of the money that's come through as a consequence of the most recent budget, which was, I think, a larger addition to the block grant than the executive had been anticipating, simply because it was a bigger spending UK budget than anticipated. One thing that's clearly helped with is dealing with the pay pressures, because that was essentially via the Barnett consequentials. It's helping the executive to deal with the same problem that helped explain why the UK government felt it had to increase spending here, and pay, obviously, because it's in particular areas like health is such a large part of the budget. Helping with that is clearly very important.
Thank you very much. I did just want to ask, I'm interested, I read probably some of the same material you've been reading, Saoirse, about the issues in getting people through the health system. Has the stabilisation funding helped with that, with health particularly?
I don't know. I mean, I remember from the work we did, if memory serves me right, average hospital stays are about 1.5 days longer in Northern Ireland than in England. Now, clearly there's the interpretation of why that is, which comes very much to your point. Is that because of quote-unquote relative inefficiency in the Northern Ireland health system? Is it because actually Northern Ireland is better at recognising the clinical need for keeping people in hospital for longer? Or is it because there are problems in other public services which mean that the constraint is on people being able to get to good care outside? I don't know whether those numbers have been updated. I suspect it will be that sort of thing is a longer term reform issue, so that's more an issue for whether the transformation work and the ongoing funding is able to help with that over 5 years. So I don't know whether in the short term the hospital time numbers have moved very sharply, and if they have, I'd be wary about wanting to see a longer period before you were confident you understood what was going on.
Okay. Gavin.
Do you mind just very briefly on the stabilisation money, Sir Robert? You're right to say that there was an allocation within that 3.3 billion of 1.15 billion pounds for stabilisation money. There was also circa 658 million pounds for immediate pay pressures to meet pay awards. And as you know, that's a one-off allocation for pay awards, and it's not recurring, though pay is. So how horrified were you when government simply said, use the stabilisation money to meet the pay pressures in year 2 and 3 once it was baselined?
Horrified is not a word. I think I looked at it, and as I say, this was a package that had short-term upfront money, a valuable contribution to longer-term sustainability through the Barnett top-up, but the gap in the middle clearly did not present a stable basis for people to be able to expect to plan on that. So I looked at that and concluded that, the Treasury is going to have to come back to this. This is unfinished business. And of course, as part of the next stage of the fiscal framework discussions, there's going to have to be some discussion about how to do that. I think if you were trying to, your point about pay being an ongoing expense, not just a one-off one, that applies in some other areas of procurement and bought-in services as well. I think, as we would have discussed before, undue reliance on one-off earmarked dollops of money is generally not the best world to be in. It's often better than not having a one-off dollop of earmarked money, but you want to move to a situation where there's a more stable underlying basis upon which departments can plan, rather than, again, a reliance on a succession of political agreements to come up with particular pots of money to address short-term problems.
Mr.
Yeah, thanks, Chair. I think it's important to note that whenever we talk about the stabilisation money, significant as it was, it still wasn't enough, for example, this current financial year to balance the books. There was a very considerable overspend, which has been largely mitigated by the greater than expected in-year Barna consequentials. But even with the stabilisation money and those Barna consequentials, there's still a deficit of about 160 million on the books, which has to be addressed before the end of the financial year. And if not, then the first of those cliff edges comes back on the books. Now, hopefully that will be addressed over that period of time, but that still is a significant gap in that respect. I should also just declare for the record that I was part of the negotiations around the financial package, but without contradicting what I just said there about stabilisation not being enough, one of the difficulties with the package is that the money for transformation, by contrast to stabilisation, was relatively small. So we're in the situation where we had the short-term sugar rush for 2 years of stabilisation, and then it ends. By contrast, the money earmarked for transformation is 235 million over 5 years, which is 47 million a year, which is relatively tiny even in the context of the Northern Ireland budget. Now, that doesn't mean that transformation won't be happening outside of that pot of money, but it shows that the balance of that was tilted more towards stabilisation, managing the crisis, rather than trying to do things differently. So we end up having more sustainable budgets down the line. So we need to have that greater shift away from this ongoing crisis management towards doing things differently and getting better outcomes as a consequence.
Okay, thank you. Claire Hannah.
Thank you very much. So Robert, I'll start with you. What's your assessment of the effectiveness of the Executive's budget sustainability plan? Do you think that it is sufficiently ambitious? And I know the revenue raising targets were stretched over a couple of years. Were there measures that you would have anticipated seeing that aren't in there?
Well, the budget sustainability plan, I think would be fair to say that it describes it combines a set of unobjectionable things that you would say about wanting to run budgets well. Obviously, the proof of that pudding is over the longer term in the way things are managed and thought through and planned. On the revenue rating, clearly this is very important in the sense that the agreement was that the additional 113 million had to be raised, and if not, the Executive was going to have to pay back 559 million, I think, essentially the money that it had to borrow short-term from the Treasury to cover the overspends of the previous 2 years next year. And that would clearly, as we say, basically would bring forward this cliff edge. So the most important thing about the budget sustainability plan is whether it's able to avoid that hit in 25-26. Now, clearly, as part of the budget, the Executive has been willing to take some decisions on revenue raising. So you've got a 5% increase in the domestic rate, a 3% increase in non-domestic rates. I think the non-domestic being a bit smaller, probably in recognition of the impact that the national insurance contributions change is having on employers. So the most important thing, I think, is that avoids that cliff edge coming earlier. You could say, well, how plausible really would it be for the Treasury to demand this money back, even if the Executive had not done that? All you're doing is simply creating another hole that they would in some other way have to fill in. Nonetheless, I think that the willingness to look at different revenue raising options, to take some decisions on that is a contribution to getting to a more sustainable position, and is more likely to make the Treasury amenable to coming up with some sort of imaginative way to deal with the later cliff edge that we were just talking about with Mazinga.
So it does tick that box, and obviously this time last year there was a lot of discussion, understandably, about the deficit and what Treasury were offering and the need to revenue raise.
Helped, as you say, by the fact that more time was provided both to come up with
it. Would you characterise that plan as ambitious?
I mean, anything that's requiring additional revenue raising at a time when households' finances are under...
Ordnance survey, map charges, increases, etc. Do you think that shows the vision that the executive needs to transform public services?
No, it shows you what you need to do to deliver on a commitment to avoid a problem with the budget allocation further on. There are then a whole wider set of issues around charging and, of course, most famously debates around water, etc., other broader charges across the public sector, other scope on the revenue raising front. But as you know, the executive is very limited in terms of its tax raising capabilities, essentially to the rates. And if you look at the possible amounts of revenue, water is obviously always pointed to, but there is very clear that's off the table for pretty much everybody across the political spectrum.
Thank you. Dorinnia, Stephen referenced potential shortfalls this year. Do you think the executive's on track to deliver a balanced budget in the coming financial year?
I think they're still certainly facing significant challenges, and I think at the, as both Sir Robert and Stephen have said, there is still around 150 million that is at risk. There will be a January monitoring round now, so that the monitoring rounds are obviously a good opportunity to look at how the entire system is doing. Certainly from my work from the financial audit side of things, I still have a lot of the departments that are through their risk registers highlighting concerns and pressures, and I don't think the departments would feel confident that they are going to deliver it, but they certainly are working very hard to try and do so, and there's a collective willingness, is my sense, to do so.
Do you think that it's possible to do so, given the, obviously there's huge need, but given the increased, even if some of it is short term, given the increased budget settlement for next year, do you think it's impossible? Do you think it's possible, I suppose, with effective decision making and addressing silos, etc., that we've discussed? Do you think it's illegitimate as somebody in your profession? Do you think it's legitimate to ask them to deliver it?
I'm ever the optimist, and I'm not probably close enough to the budget monitoring rounds to know the particular pressures or where departments are potentially considering cutting services or holding back. But certainly at this stage of the year, I'll err on the side of optimism. I'll not know that until we come to the end of March and I start my financial audit cycle, so I couldn't say with certainty until I see the figures, Claire. Sorry.
Can I just say, I mean, departments have managed to deal with overspends larger than that at this. So it's down. The potential overspend was about 830 million in October, and is now, as you say, it was 148.6 million. So a little under 150. Obviously, one thing departments can do is simply delay expenditure, and if you're just delaying it into the following year, then that's not necessarily fully dealing with it. But I would be surprised to see an overspend at the end of the year with something like less than 150 at this point, but it's stretching nonetheless, and the danger is that it's dealt with in a way that just pushes the can slightly further down the road.
Stephen, your unit made a number of recommendations in its response about ways maybe to make things more sustainable, and things like that preventative DEL spending. Do you think that with the figures on the table and sufficient joined up thinking and vision, that it is possible for the executive to deliver decent public services and a balanced budget? And separately, are you optimistic that they will do so?
At this stage, I think first of all, on the public finances, I think we're dealing, Claire, with a very challenging situation. Now, on the surface, the very large bar of consequences of 918 million in year, and then, well, turns into effect 1.5 billion for the next financial year. On paper, may well solve the problems for the executive. However, we have to bear in mind, first of all, that even with the 918 million in year, we're still running this deficit, and there's been deficits for the past 2 years previous to that as well. So there's a structural problem within the executive. So does that then shift from 918 to 1.5 billion address those immediate problems? I'm not sure it does, because there's other pressures coming through the system, in the sense that we have the national insurance increase for employers, which hasn't kicked in, which will affect all parts of the UK, of course, but that may well eat up things. There's public sector pressures, pay pressures, which will be adding to that. And we also know that even beyond the current situation, there's other inescapable pressures that still haven't been met. So we're in a situation where there may be slightly more breathing space to keep the lights on, but we're not seeing that shift towards doing things different in terms of transformation. And those are the type of the areas where we were trying to highlight around preventative DEL, the wider discussion around prevention. And at times there is that reluctance to consider that shift left or upstream, depending on the language, to doing things differently, because the results often don't emerge for several years down the line. So it's seen as a bit of a punt, and it means that perhaps in the short term, what you're trying to do to sustain public services becomes even more challenging, because you're taking money away from that, and people are reluctant to do it. But if we don't break this cycle, where we end up in that perpetual situation where we're not just maintaining the status quo, we will fall behind other jurisdictions in terms of outcomes. So we do need to have that much more fundamental shift. And I think also, we'll probably touch on this in greater detail, I don't think, shall we say, what we're talking about around the fiscal floor shift in terms of numbers, even if we move from 125 to 124 to 127, is going to be a game changer in terms of getting us out of the current hole. Nor will the revenue raising necessarily do that as well, because there's a lead-in time. Even though if it was politically possible to do some of the measures, there's a lead-in time around water charging of a couple of years in terms of getting the systems operational. So those aren't necessarily going to be magical solutions for us.
You're right, and I think colleagues will come back to that, and that's my point. There was a lot of talk about getting this right a year ago, and it feels like we're maybe back into some of the old habit. Do you think it's a fair assessment then that this first budget, clearly judging by your submission, you're disappointed, I suppose, in some of the lack of ambition in it? Do you think it's possible that this was the, I suppose, levelling budget, and do you anticipate seeing a bit more ambition and a bit more bravery from the executive in the subsequent years of this mandate? Yeah,
well, I think we need to recognise that the executive has delivered a draft budget, and they've done it in a reasonably timely way, so that is positive. But I do think there's an overall sense that this is essentially biding time. This is more or less more of the same that has happened in Northern Ireland.
I think we're setting our expectations a wee bit low after 2 years of negotiation,
perhaps,
and 10 months back, that just getting a draft programme for government and a draft budget, do you think we're setting our expectations a bit low if we're celebrating just getting drafts?
I think in defence of the executive, there is, shall we say, a recognition that the next iteration is the real game changer, because we're moving to potentially multi-year budget. The executive have put through their draft programme for government, and there may well be different views on how good or otherwise that PFG is, but those will become that. We're now seeing the potential for the linkage between the programme for government and the budget on the years ahead. So that hopefully we'll see the step change that we're looking for. At the moment, I recognise the point you're making, in the sense that we're still doing a lot of what was done in previous years, and just trying to make do, but that opportunity for change may well come soon.
Thank you, Chair.
Okay, thank you. Lead very nicely on to Dan Aldridge.
Hi, thanks. I mean, multi-year budgets are something I think many of us are breathing a bit of a sigh of relief around. I know in my constituency in Western-super-Mare, it's seen as a game changer and a move away from a very destabilising period for public services. So, in your view, and I don't mind who goes first, what effect would multi-year budgets have on establishing stabilising, sustainable finances?
It is clearly desirable. So I think this is, in the Northern Ireland context, it's the 10th or 11th consecutive single-year budget, which is obviously a different situation from the UK, because for Northern Ireland to run a multi-year budget, you need to have the institutions to be stable and in place, and you need to have a multi-year budget at the UK level to give you a multi-year block grant settlement, and we haven't had that for a decade or more. So clearly it is very desirable. I think just coming back to Claire's last point, both at the UK and arguably and at the executive level, this budget is the sort of the last 1 year one, and there's a bit of throat clearing ahead of what people hope to be a greater degree of medium-term thinking and planning, both in Westminster and as the possibility of having... So the aim that the UK government wants to get to is to having 3-year budgets essentially with a 1 year overlap. So you would come back and review the third year as the first year of the following. So it's not a huge move to very multi-year, but it's clearly better than nothing, and clearly offers, in the Northern Ireland context, if this cliff edge can be sorted out, because obviously planning across that with that change would be very odd, because you're then trying to take the advantage of a multi-year budget to sort of do planning, but also you've got an implausible drop in funding that you might assume would then move again. So assuming that can be sorted out, and there appears to be will to try to do that, I think it could be very useful. The one caveat I would say is that the UK government does change its spending plans more frequently than its multi-year budgets. So if you were to look at the draft budget that was published for consultation but never agreed by the previous executive in 2021, and let's imagine that you'd set your workforce planning and everything on the basis of that. If you go back now, the amounts of money are actually very different from what was put in there because of the fact that the UK government has felt the need to increase public spending here since then, and that's fed through to consequentials. So a multi-year block grant settlement clearly gives departments and the executive as a whole a greater and more stable platform from which to think about and do sensible things, but that doesn't mean that it's written in stone, and it is not written in stone for reasons that are outside the executive's control, namely if the UK government changes its spending plans, because that will then move the numbers still.
I think if I could just add to that, from my perspective, and we have called for multi-year budgets and do see the benefit in certain areas of our work as well. And I think, put quite simplicity, it will allow for longer term planning, and especially for large infrastructure projects, for things that just naturally can't be delivered within a 1 year window. But the element of certainty and stability that would come with that, I think, shouldn't be overlooked for departments as well, because we have all talked about this constant firefighting mode that they've been in. I think multi-year budgets in themselves are not fully the answer, and we have to be very clear, and we have said as well that we would like to see a multi-year budget needs to be linked to the programme for government, linked to the outcomes then that are going to be achieved, and then from my perspective we need to monitor those outputs as well, so it's not, it's about really making ourselves accountable for that spending and not forgetting about monitoring the achievement of what we're doing with the multi-year budgets as well. So there's quite a process there that certainly from my perspective we'd like to see in place.
Can I just come back on that a second? So before we move on to you, Stephen. We often talk about kind of changing the levers and then things will be delivered. But if you're talking about a culture of a decade, responding to a decade of single year settlements and firefighting, is there a process of cultural change and a bit of support that needs to happen within the public sector and the civil service to be able to move, to be able to deliver in a longer term sense? Does that make sense to you?
Yeah, no, I understand the question you're asking. Yeah, and I think certainly it will require a shift. I think though certainly my sense is public servants have felt very frustrated by the lack of multi-year budgets. There's a real desire, so I don't think, cultural change is usually quite difficult. I don't think in this circumstance that change would be inconceivable, because I think that the desire is there. There are obviously certain projects, capital projects by nature are multi-year. You do have to go out and procure certain services multi-year. So public servants have had to, plan for multi-year spending in the absence of multi-year budgets. So I think the mechanisms are there.
I was just going to make a slightly related point on budgets. I agree with what my colleagues have said around multi-year budgets, but whenever we talk about the 10, 11 years of single year budgets, often some of those budgets were actually agreed after the start of the financial year rather than before, which has created real uncertainty for particularly those organisations that receive grants from government. I mean, departments can spend at their own risk, but where you have, particularly in the community voluntary sector, organisations getting grant aid money, and that can't be agreed, that creates real uncertainty for their staff, and that they often lose people. That often, in terms of process, that have to put people on protected notice. So some people will move on from their jobs, and they lose capacity in that respect. So that has been a structural difficulty in the system. It has knock-on effects as well for things like pre-planning of commissioned places in terms of health training through universities, and obviously workforce is absolutely crucial in terms of the health sector. So we're trying to avoid that. Now, obviously last year, the current year's budget was agreed in May. That's relatively understandable given the Assembly had just been restored in February, and people were just getting their feet on the table with the new departments. But whenever the NAO were striking budgets, they often happened after the start of the financial year as well, and that did cause added inefficiency in the system.
Okay, thank you. Adam.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you all for coming. My wife's in Northern Ireland this week, and it's pretty snowy and cold, so well done for making it over the Irish Sea, and a happy New Year to you. A couple of quick things. So, Robert, nice to see you again. You touched on the £559 million overspend, and I just want to unpick a little bit of that, if that's okay. Firstly, what would the impact on public service in Northern Ireland be of having to repay that £559 million in your view?
Well, it would be a significant short-term hit to the budget. So it's not only a significant sum of money, but you would be getting the news of that at a very short term. We will be talking about that next year. So, again, whether it is, some people would say it's therefore not a credible threat to withdraw that at that sort of level, but if it were to happen, then it would severely complicate the task of people trying to manage public services through the next couple of years.
Yeah, from my perspective, public services are already under pressure, under considerable pressure. So any further debt, if you like, that is being added to is only going to put them under increasing pressure. And we've touched on the need for transformation, the need for change, and Stephen has talked about the relatively small sums of money that are ring fenced for that. But so any additional space for change or transformation outside of that, I think, would be very, very difficult indeed.
Yeah, I mean, essentially, we're talking about the two cliff edges. The 559 million, I agree with Sir Robert that may not be even fully levied in the context that there was a continued overspend. But I think there will be a means to address the current overspend to avoid that happening. The bigger cliff edge is the end of the stabilisation funding of 520 million a year, and how that's then going to be picked up in terms of the black hole, and to what extent then any potential change in the fiscal framework or the fiscal floor can address that, and that obviously is far from agreed. And revenue raising, are those going to address that 520 million removal? I would be sceptical that that's going to be the case.
And just with your indulgence, just a couple more questions. One, do you think that Northern Ireland can get away with not repaying that 559 million pounds back? If you see what I mean.
If it was asked for it,
yeah.
No. I mean, that would then have even more serious consequences in terms of the Treasury's provision of money in the future. So there is a requirement under UK legislation for the executive to balance its budgets. Now, balance can in this context include a loan to help you do that, which was the way in which it happened over that period. I think, as I say, there's a question mark as to whether, if the Treasury is inflexible, it is simply creating more problems for itself as well as for the Northern Ireland Executive looking forward. So that's the sort of grey area about how credible this is. I mean, the same issue arose when you had the second year of overspend on the period in which of the pass the parcel on the budget, is how credible was it the Treasury actually to demand the money back, given the consequences that would have had for public services. So there's an element of game playing inevitably here. But if you take the take the strict rules, then it would be very problematic for the Executive in terms of the resources that the Treasury was willing to provide in future. In a realpolitik world, there would be a negotiation about, can you really expect to remove that given the consequences that would have. It would be a more extreme example of the quandary the Treasury found itself in discussions with the Executive and with NIO over the previous 2 years.
It speaks to the challenge that I think we're all trying to tease out here, doesn't it, of decisions. So Robert, you just touched on, and I'd be interested to hear from all three of you, the Treasury and the UK government and such. What benefit do you think the government's growth agenda can play in helping alleviate some of the pressures facing the UK government's growth agenda, alleviate some of the pressures facing Northern Ireland and their public services?
You go, Robert.
And the key thing to bear in mind, I mean, the vast bulk of what the Executive has available to spend is essentially down to the block grant, and the changes in the block grant reflect changes in UK government spending, as I say, essentially on things in England for which the Executive is responsible in Northern Ireland. So anything that makes the UK Treasury happier to think that it can spend more money in a sustainable way, and that would include good performance in the UK economy, underlying performance, not just a sort of short-term sugar rush, would provide more money in through the to the Executive if that's reflected in UK government budget decisions. As we've discussed, I think before, I mean, one of the ironies is that there is not a particularly close relationship between the performance of the Northern Ireland economy and the amount of money that comes into the Executive, again, because it's coming in very much from the block grant. Yes, there is some money coming in from the rates, but the relationship between what you get in from the rates and the performance of the economy, there is a relationship there, but it's not a particularly straightforward one. So it's clearly having an improved performance in the Northern Ireland economy is great for Northern Ireland households and for jobs and employment and for earnings, and is devoutly to be desired, but it doesn't have a direct impact through to the amount of money that the Executive spends. Similarly, if the UK growth performance improves, that's also a good thing and desirable, and will bring in more tax revenue generally, to the extent that that is then reflected in the UK Treasury feeling that it's willing to spend more money. That will then show up in Barnett consequentials.
Just to really restate the point I made at the start, that the additional Barnett consequentials coming across may simply in Northern Ireland help avoid a greater default happening in terms of the public finances, or avoid a default happening. The question is, can Northern Ireland, through obviously under devolution, do things their own way in terms of local decision making, but can they replicate the scale of investment that's happening in England and Scotland and Wales on the back of that additional resource, or do we see that gap actually widening? Because obviously there's big investment happening in health, and even in education, going back to the previous government, there was a notable increase in health spending in England, which wasn't replicated in Northern Ireland. So we end up in a situation where we're better able to keep the lights on in Northern Ireland. There's less risk of a problem, but we're not at the same time doing the equivalent investments that are happening elsewhere, and as a consequence we fall behind further.
Yeah, no, that's interesting. I mean, so Robert's just touched on rates and levels of them. I mean, is there more space, do you think? I mean, where is Northern Ireland rather in the sort of scale and table of rates? I know there's issues about paying for water and all the rest of it. But where's Northern Ireland, and where are Northern Ireland households in relation to for example, my constituents in Newcastle and Lyme, or indeed in Surrey and Northumberland and the rest?
It's a frequently asked question, and it's interesting to hear the contrast in perception from MPs in England compared to local situation. Revenue raising is very heavily politically contentious. Under the budget sustainability plan, 113 million was identified. There is potential for more revenue raising. Whether we will see a political consensus around that is challenging. Some of those will have lead-in times, but I think that the sum total of what's called the super priority measures is around 590 to about 690 in terms of what could be raised, compared to some of the measures that happen in England. But even if all of that was done, I'm not sure that in itself is a game changer for Northern Ireland, and also some of those measures, even if they were politically acceptable, would have a lead-in time in terms of structure. I mean, just give an example. I mean, around water, you're talking about 18 months, 2 years potentially to have the infrastructure for domestic billing to happen. Previously, decisions were taken not to install water meters in new houses, for example, which maybe makes that even more challenging in terms of having the physical infrastructure to proceed with some approaches to charging. Obviously, there are other approaches you could do that don't need meters, but so it's not easy to turn that tap on and off, pardon the puns.
Yeah. Just for clarity, I wasn't advocating, I don't fill out my
No, absolutely. Nor was I, just for the record too.
It was unpicking and trying to understand. Thank you very much.
Okay, David Smith.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you all for all of your answers so far. I was going to ask a question about the likelihood and impact of the funding cliff edge, but you've talked quite a lot about that, and it seems to me that cliff edge is receding somewhat. Feel free to contradict that if you disagree. So I'd like to sort of, first of all, establish that I understand things correctly and then ask you a question. This perhaps a bit, zoomed out slightly. So the fiscal framework that the executive is currently working to in relation to the UK government includes the target for 113 million for income generation by April 26, alongside the budget sustainability plan itself, which is underway, and delivering a balanced budget in this year in 24-25. And if those three things are delivered upon, then this £550 million historic departmental overspends will be written off by the Treasury. So far, so good. Yeah, right, yep. Good. Now, it seems like the exec is on target currently to meet that £113 million income generation, possibly about 80 million already secured. Here's the question. So, is it correct? Sorry, one final point before the question. On the balanced budget piece, the Finance Minister acknowledged late last year that the exec was still on course to overspend. And Professor Farry, you said, I think at the time it was 267 million, but you said it's more like 160 now?
Under 150 now.
Yes. 58.6 was the November number.
It's on the record. Great to hear it. Now, I guess the question is it correct to say that if the exec deliver the income generation target, then the 550 million debt will still be written off, even if there's a significant in-year overspend again this year or next year? Is that correct?
Well, the overspend will be written off if there's no... the historic overspend will be written off if there's no overspend during this current financial year. So that 148 does have to be addressed by one means or another. But as Sir Robert and Dorinnia have said, I mean, there are measures by which that can be managed. It is a significant sum, but they will manage that. So hopefully that issue doesn't become a live one, and they will be able to generate the 113 million in terms of revenue raising. So on the surface, that will be addressed. Those are very low-hanging bars in terms of the challenges for Northern Ireland in terms of the wider picture. And in some senses, the bigger issue is what's going to happen when the 520 million stabilisation fund is removed from the picture in the following financial year, the 26-27 financial year, in light of the structural problems that we have in terms of Northern Ireland's budgets. We do have, nonetheless, the additional Barna consequentials coming through, which may ease the scale of the pressure, but the challenge is that even with that, there are other pressures in the system around the national insurance, employer national insurance rise, public pay pressures will eat a lot of that up. So we're still in a situation where structurally the executive will be potentially running future deficits, just given the scale of what it's doing, unless things are done radically different in terms of the approach to this. So I think we're hopefully, and say this with a degree of caution, not going to face that in the immediate future, but structurally Northern Ireland's approach to finances isn't sustainable in the medium term.
And open this up to the other panels as well. You're confident that that 140 million projected overspend as we sit here now by April this year will be balanced?
I wouldn't bet my house on it.
Well, there's your responsibility.
Departments have, it has been possible to manage down gaps larger than that at this point in the year. As I say, one way you can do that is in part by delaying expenditure into next year, which to some degree is pushing the can down the road. But I think it's at the manageable end of overspends at this point in the financial year.
That's it. I think it's by no means certain. I suppose that's just to come in. It's by no means certain. The one thing that all public bodies are sitting with, certain things that they can't delay as well. Public organisations, on average, probably over 70% of their recurrent funding is their pay bill, and that's not something that is going to go away. I take Sir Robert's point about it. It has been managed in the past. I think certainly departments are still indicating to me it's not without its pressures.
Do you have the same confidence, if I can say that word, for financial year 25-26 in terms of a balanced budget for the exec?
I mean, it's too early at this stage to see. We will see as you move into the year, and the Department of Finance will then basically gets data from the departments every month as to whether they're living within that budget at that stage. Clearly, it's a lot more likely that you can be within budget, having seen the increase in Barnett consequentials that are coming through as a result of that. Entirely taking Stephen's points that obviously this is partly, going to be swallowed up by the same pressures that have required the UK government to increase spending at the UK level. But it's too early to say yet whether there's going to be ongoing pressures at that stage. I mean, clearly you're further away. There's more chance to take decisions that can have an impact at that stage. But if you look at the last few years, then, there's been ongoing pressures, and it's always been a challenge to get those numbers to match up to the available funding.
If we can just ask, thank you. If we can just ask one last question, slightly more esoteric. Is there a chance that the exec may be being rewarded by the UK Treasury for what some might describe as fiscal failure?
Moral hazard?
That was the second follow-up question. I've actually got that written down. But
is there
a moral hazard here?
Yeah. I mean, that may well be a perception of the situation. I think from the Northern Ireland context, and I mean, this has been reflected by political parties across the spectrum, there is an argument that Northern Ireland hasn't been funded in line with its relative need, and that's the crux of this debate around the level of the fiscal floor and whether that should have been in place earlier, and indeed is the right figure currently in place. So it's probably two different perceptions of the point from different places.
Tell your former MP.
I think one point to make is that obviously there's art and science in the 124 estimate, but if you take that as a reasonable basis, and the first point I think is the Treasury has for decades accepted the fact that Northern Ireland needs to spend more on public services per head of population than is spent in England, and that the funding system should deliver that. It's very clear about that. We'll make the same arguments in the other devolved administrations as well. Spending funding per head was higher than 124, some years back. We had a period in which it was falling very sharply towards 124 and essentially going through it. And in a sense, one of the things that the executive and as the parcel was operating, was having to deal with, was that that squeeze in relative terms as you moved from what looked, probably didn't feel like it at the time, as a relatively comfortable funding position to one which looked much closer to a reasonable estimate of need and was then going under that. So I think that the Treasury was willing to accept the 124 estimate as a basis for the interim package. There's obviously doubtless people will want to come back to that numbers from both directions as time goes by. So when you look at the way in which the Treasury has sort of dealt with the overspends and has been thinking about the fiscal framework, they're obviously trying to balance the fact that there's a genuine need to provide adequate funding for Northern Ireland, the fact that it does come very predominantly from the block grants, so there is a responsibility on the Treasury to ensure that the system is working in that way. But on the other hand, an entirely understandable view in the Treasury that you need to ensure that people work with the budgets that they've got to work with, and they wield the stick in that argument just as much around the corridors here as in their relationships with the devolved administrations as well. There are more complications in the way in which you have to do that. There's less flexibilities around that than some departments would have. So the Treasury is always trying to balance the fact that you've got to provide a basis for sustainable public services, but you've also got to try to encourage all the devolved administrations and every department to think very carefully about the sort of transformation work you could be doing. Are you spending your money efficiently? Are you taking the scope to raise revenue where that is appropriate and within the responsibility of a particular department or organisation? So Treasury is wrestling with that dilemma everywhere and all the time.
Yeah, and that probably leads us nicely on. So, Robert, you were talking about the Treasury recognising that there was a need for additional funding in Northern Ireland as to other parts of the UK, certainly talking about the fiscal floor. Stephen, probably one to say, why? Why does Northern Ireland need that additional level of funding?
A variety of reasons. So the most sort of comprehensive exercise looking at this was actually spanned the different devolved administrations, which we based our 124 estimate, which Jerry Holtham did when there was a discussion for a fiscal framework in Wales some years ago. So you're looking at issues like the age structure of the population, the fact that Northern Ireland has a relatively rural population compared to England, the proportion of people on benefits, proportion of people in ethnic minorities, etc. So Jerry Holtham used that exercise to come up with estimates of relative need for spending per head across the different devolved administrations. In addition, of course, with Northern Ireland, there is the specific issue of the relative need for spending on security and policing and justice, where obviously there are special security and political factors that play into that make it harder to just come up with some sort of metric that you can apply across all the regions of the UK to come up with a number there. And one of the debates around whether 124 is the appropriate number is on what basis should you try to calculate the relative need for spending on policing and justice, and some people would say it should be higher, some people would say that it's content with that. Agriculture would be another area which again wasn't in the original Holtham analysis, but sparsity of the population, age structure, benefit dependency, policing and justice, particular state of agriculture, those are the sorts of things that have always been accepted as part of that calculation.
Probably just two further things to say around the fiscal floor argument. There is this debate about the level, whether it's 124 or higher. That is perhaps the crux of where there's been a lot of focus. I think it's fair to say that the actual impact in resource terms of even a shift from 124 higher, if that can be achieved, is going to be fairly minimal in terms of the grand scheme of things. I mean, we're talking perhaps a couple of $100 million additional. It's also worth noting to the committee as well that the fiscal floor at present applies to bar consequentials. Now, it remains the official position of the Northern Ireland Executive, and indeed many people and parties argued for this at the time, that this should be both backdated to the start of the previous spending period, the multi-year budget in the UK in the early part of this decade, and also baselined. Now, I think, and Sir Robert can keep me right on this one if I get this wrong, but in practice, with the interim fiscal framework, both of those angles are off the table. Essentially, we're talking about simply that discussion about 124 versus something higher, and that has to be properly evidenced if there's going to be a change in that particular regard. And I'm not sure we're seeing a lot of evidence coming through at this stage. And just given the timing of perhaps the next spending review happening across the UK, that piece of work probably needs to be concluded fairly sharpish over the next number of months. This is not going to be an elongated process, so there is a lot of work to be done in a short period of time to build that evidence base, and I'm not sure that we're at that stage just yet of having compiled it.
I think Steve's absolutely right that moving from 124 to 127, for example, would not make a big financial difference certainly in the near term, will build up over time, but would be a relatively small amount of time. And that's because the 124 is applying not to the calculation of the total block grant, it's applying to any additions to it, or in principle subtractions from it, as the UK government changes spending in the UK. There would be an alternative model, which is to say, let's forget about the Barnett formula altogether and simply set the Northern Ireland block grant at 124 or 120x% of spending in England per head, and therefore move it onto judging need for the block grant as a whole rather than an addition. That would be more consequential more quickly. It might be one way of trying to deal with how do you cope with this gap without providing dollops, because just increasing 124 will not resolve that 26-27 cliff edge. However, moving to a directly needs-based funding model in Northern Ireland alone would not be straightforward, because you'd then be looking at Wales and Scotland. The Scottish government, I think, would be particularly nervous at the possibility that you might move in that direction for a directly needs-based view, given historically the funding there. So, as ever, moving from a funding position that in part reflects historical accident to something that is coherently designed is never a straightforward exercise.
I know. Dr. Al Pinkerton.
Thank you. And we're at that point in the proceedings where the excellence of your answers has stolen some of the questions. Because we were going to talk at this point about need and actual level of need in Northern Ireland. But I think particularly Stephen and Robert, you've both covered that actually really, really neatly. So I'm going to now steal Gavin's number 10 question, which actually I think comes back to one of the points that you were just making. I mean, Stephen, you made the very powerful point that just moving to, let's say, 127 isn't going to make a material difference, and Robert, you echoed that. So I think one of the things that we, and also Robert, you mentioned the nervousness that other parts of the UK would have if we fundamentally transformed the model. So given that we have the model that we currently have, the interim fiscal framework states that there will be a consideration of a review at some point if there are enough sources that can demonstrate why need might be different to 124. Are you aware of those sources? What would those sources be? What kind of evidence would you draw upon or would be drawn upon in order to make that determination of increased need? What evidence would be required to be brought together to demonstrate a greater need than the 124?
I think that mention of flexibility, it was important and necessary for that to be in the interim fiscal framework, to get agreement at the executive level for that to be through. Whether the Treasury in its heart of hearts thinks that the possibility of there being a large volume of independent evidence suggesting that the number should be different is possibly debatable. If you go back to when Department of Finance was giving evidence at the Stormont Finance Committee, I think their focus was around the policing and justice issue, because it's essentially a sort of it's a category of spending with issues unique to Northern Ireland, rather than trying to unpick or recalculate all the Holtham work where there are different judgments that you could take that would push that up, but also there are judgments you could take that would push that down. On the policing and justice issue, essentially you come back to debates around what is the appropriate period in the past to sort of look at as an appropriate way if you take the view that past spending if you can't measure needs directly, and some people have tried around police numbers, for example, in the Northern Ireland context, but you look at the levels of past spending and try to infer it from that. Then, what is do you look at the last period in which the UK government was setting the budget, as that's their revealed indication of how much ought to be spent there. So it sounded very much as if there was any sort of focus, it would be around that item. That's not without risk. I have to say that if you were trying to run a sort of big public campaign with the Treasury saying that you need additional money on the basis that Northern Ireland is expensive to secure and police, whether the rights or wrongs of that, that's also sending signals to people around that may have some unintended consequences in terms of attractiveness to investment, etc. So it will be interesting to see whether they pursue that line. But certainly the way in which DOF were describing it, that seemed to be the focus of where you would look for different evidence. On the calculation stuff, as I say, I suspect that the Treasury could find some arguments to say it should be lower to match any other argument that came along to say it would be higher, but the policing justice is a more unique issue.
Stephen, do you want to come in on that?
Robert's largely set that out. To answer your second question, I think it was your first question actually, what efforts are happening at present? Just anecdotally, I know certainly the Department of Finance in Northern Ireland is seeking people to come forward with that. I'm not sure there's been a huge number that have been able to produce that robust evidence base to date, and again that we're probably looking at a fairly short timetable in terms of doing this piece of work as well, given the timing of the wider spending review for the UK, which is coming along. But even with that, the scale of the shift from 124, even if we manage to achieve 127, is not going to be the game changer in light of everything else we've been talking about previously.
So, moving the numbers may not be easy in itself. It also may be opening up an undesirable kind of worms. One of the other omissions that I think you mentioned from the original Holtham calculations was the absence of agriculture from that calculation. Is that something worthy of pursuit? Does Northern Ireland agriculture require additional support relative to, for example, the rest of the UK, and could that be a productive way forward?
Well, I think this is inevitably going to complicate the calculation both of how high Northern Ireland spending is relative to UK government spending, and then possibly equivalently the discussion of need, because the Treasury in the budget removed the ring fence around agricultural support funds. So as you'll recall, there was support coming from the EU, which when we left the EU, the Treasury said essentially would guarantee to pay the same amount of money to baiters whether it did or not through to the end of the Parliament. We then had the end of the Parliament. So I think around 300 million is essentially going to be in the baseline from 2025-26 onwards. So taking that on its own, you have increased the Barnettable funding, and that would push up the premium relative to England. Now, equivalently, you could say, well, you shouldn't do that without at the same time adjusting your estimate of need equivalently, so you've got it on both sides of the balance sheet. And I suspect there's quite a lot of techie conversation going on between the Treasury and the Department of Finance as to exactly how that happens. One thing we've been very keen on is actually seeing some backdated estimates of what the Treasury believes the premium to have been in the past and to be at the present. They've put out estimates of the premium in the alongside the budget, which, as I say, is a bit above 124 with the package, a bit below it without it. But I suspect in the final fiscal framework, all the numbers will need a bit of tweaking to reflect the fact that you've now had this ring-fenced agricultural support going into the baseline. And I think, someone may correct me if I'm wrong, that there's a smaller sum of money on cybersecurity again, which was earmarked and now isn't. So the overall pot versus the little additions to the pot balance may have changed slightly at the margin, and that'll, mean tweaking lots of calculations.
Okay, thank you very much. Simon Hall.
Thank you, Chair. Reference has been made in some earlier answers and conversations with regards to the Public Sector Transformation Board, which of itself is, of course, to be welcomed. To transform public services without just sort of rattling the begging bowl, I don't use that in a pejorative sense of the term, is often not for the squeamish and requires political stability and agreement of the necessity and what's in scope and what's out of scope. Should we have any concerns about the ability of the Transformation Board to deliver? And I don't really mind who answers that first.
Well, I think one point to make is the amount of money that is at stake here in terms of the board having to make decisions is relatively small at around 47 million a year for 5 years. As Stephen's made the point in his recent report, all governments and the Northern Ireland Executive should be thinking much more holistically about transformation and doing things better and more efficiently, well beyond what you could cover with some projects that add up to 47. A decision that the board will have to take in the advice that it gives to the Department of Finance is obviously whether you spread even that small 47 million thinly over a large number of things or confine it to maybe 2 or 3 that are likely to be more impactful. That will be one important decision. I think, as my understanding, colleagues will correct me if I'm wrong, there's been, not entirely surprisingly, bids for much more than the available 3 times or so the available sum of money for this. It remains to be seen, therefore, which of these will actually be favoured, which looks sensible but unfundable. And it would obviously be desirable if you had things which were sensible but can't be done with a 47 million to encourage those to be done anyway. But the board itself, I think, it's a relatively small board. I think there's an interesting question about what the makeup of that board is over the longer. Do you want it to fulfil a longer term function, linked or not linked to funding? Who are the right people to be on that? Should it have more independent membership than it does at the moment? So it's at a relatively small scale at this stage. We haven't seen what its recommendations are. We don't know what the long-term vision for its role is, but it's a good thing to have as a start.
Okay. Could I ask Professor Farry, we're getting the band back together, I suppose.
Yes, indeed.
Stephen, which is which is
oh dear,
a terrible sense of déjà vu. The question I wanted to ask you is, witnesses of reference, and we all readily understand the historical challenges of delivering public service across Northern Ireland, and Ms Carville has referenced the byproduct of Stormont not sitting, etc., in terms of driving forward change. So the backlog for the impetus for change is greater than it would be in other parts of the UK. Is that, what's your assessment, is that readily understood? I'm not saying welcomed, but readily understood. And in that trade-off between maintaining the functioning of Stormont per se, against some of those very pressing, sometimes dated public sector reform challenges, where do you see the sort of pinch point being, and on which side of the coin comes up top?
Well, I think it is relatively understood by being professional public servants that things need to be done differently. I think the difficulty is that there is people are captive of the current crisis that they're in, and they are constantly firefighting, so there isn't the space and time to do more creative thinking on transformation and how things could be done differently and better, because they are essentially tasked with keeping the lights on. And often some of the more transformative issues will require a longer lead-in time to to show the benefits of doing things differently. In theory, transformation will provide more efficiency in terms of the use of public money, but perhaps more importantly, better outcomes in terms of health and education, etc., across the board. So it does need to be done, but it's essentially moving from a situation of perpetual crisis financially to a time where there can be proper planning. And I suppose you could argue that there's no better time than a crisis, perhaps, than to do things differently. I think it's fair to say that the sums that are earmarked for transformation are relatively small, and Sir Robert talked about the bids being almost 3 times what was available. Now that can mean one of two things. It either means that there is a huge hunger in the system for transformation projects, or equally it can mean that, which often happens with these earmarked funds, that you see departments trying to shift what are current inescapable pressures that haven't been otherwise addressed through the budget or being pushed into this fund, and it may well be a mixture of both of those. But we certainly need to see more creative thinking. I think the numbers are those 29 projects that were shortlisted by the board. Of those, I think 11 are being taken forward. There's 18 of the 29 that are still live, but they're all digital, interesting. So the majority of the 29 were of a digital nature. And so those are being considered collectively as part of a technology landscape review that's happening under the Department of Finance. So that's sort of a bit more context in terms of what's currently going through that transformation board. The final thing I would say in transformation is that I think the executive needs to find the opportunity to argue for more resource for transformation. And if there is to be a second round of negotiations with the Treasury in terms of how to open up additional funds to keep the lights on, then it may be that offering to do more in transformation and being held to that may well be the opportunity through which that can be achieved.
Just pausing there, would you like to see a more bargaining mindset, if you will, from HMT, which effectively says we understand the issues and the pressures in the history. We understand the need for additional per capita expenditure. There has to be a quid pro quo, and therefore, for a pound saved, you get whatever it may happen. I'm not going to go into the semantics of the numbers. Do you think that would help drive the understanding of necessity, and that it's not an issue that can be dodged?
I think that there's a logic in certainly upping the transformation narrative and the funding and the structure around that, and there may well be a trade-off in terms of getting additional resource, but having that earmarked for transformation. Part of the pushback that's come in the Northern Ireland political system is that there are some people who are challenging why the NIO are even involved in this process. That's become a source of discontent. But from my own perspective, I see the logic in that this has been part of a financial package that's coming from Treasury, and that it's an obvious desire to ensure that they're getting results in that particular respect, but nonetheless it has become contentious. So just for clarity, Judy Harrison, the PermSec and the NIO sits on that transformation board.
Ms. Carville, your observations? Or?
Yeah, if I could just pick up on potentially, both your points to some degree. I think it is too early to sound any concerns. And from my knowledge of the Transformation Fund, it's not something that I've audited. I have indicated to the head of the civil service I will audit it in due course. But the areas that the proposals are being assessed against are areas that are very welcome. They're focused on financial sustainability, on change, on the early prevention piece, but and aligned to the programme for government. And at the core of it all, the head of civil service has given me a briefing on it, and they're seeking innovation. But to pick up on your second point, I think it is not to go unnoticed that Northern Ireland civil servants, through that period of single year budgets, lack of governments, there is a risk aversion that has naturally crept in, and innovation and risk aversion do not sit well together. And it's something, we published a good practice guide 2 years ago on innovation and risk management, because there is a real need for innovation, especially when we're thinking about transformation. Innovation brings risk, it absolutely does, but there needs to be a lack of risk aversion, well-managed risk taken to drive forward innovation. So that will be a challenge. It will be a challenge on delivery, but there's a real willingness and a real leadership from the top to try and achieve that.
My final question, Chair, if I may, just sort of following from that, is what else could could Westminster, UK government, do to help drive that forward, to deploy its good offices and experiences and expertise? And also, one of the sort of we've often used, have we not, this phrase of sort of devolve and forget. That one devolves a competence and therefore presumes that the competence is manifest within the devolved area. One of the downsides of devolution is that the devolved areas can become very inward-looking and feel either a lack of confidence in reaching out to ask Cardiff and Edinburgh and London, or take your permutations thereof. In order to help fill that lacuna which has been created of there hasn't been any transformation due to political instability, what more could the UK government be doing to help fill that sort of skills gap, that appetite gap? And do you have any observations on the executives and Stormont, in a wider sense, appetite to reach out to other devolves within the UK to say, how did you do it? Or what are you doing in this space? Can we pick your brains? Can we second, etc.?
Certainly from my work, when we look at whatever subject matter we look at, we always try and benchmark and look to other jurisdictions. Where is doing it best? Where can we learn from? Typically, they're our nearest neighbours, England, Scotland, Wales, the Republic of Ireland, but we will look further afield as well. So you will often see in our publications, we'll highlight someone that is doing a particular area well. I'm working very closely with the Public Accounts Committee. They've 3 inquiries under their belt and they've 2 in transit. Again, they're doing the same thing. They're looking to other jurisdictions. So to take your point, I can only speak for that committee, but there's an appetite there to learn from who is doing it well. They've been commissioning their own research papers in certain subject areas, looking to England, looking to Scotland. We did a report a couple of years ago on capacity and capability in the Northern Ireland Civil Service. The Public Accounts Committee predecessor one took that report and they made a direct recommendation to try and build a model that was based on the UK Cabinet Office model. So there is a keenness and an evidentially based keenness to look at other jurisdictions, to learn from them and to work collaboratively together where it's in the best interest of the people of Northern Ireland.
Okay. Thank you, Chair. Lovely to be back.
Lovely to have you. I'm just going to take a supplementary off Sauter Eastwood.
Thank you, Chair. This is something I think is really at the crux of what we're trying to get at here. Transformation is going to be key in terms of Northern Ireland public finance, and one of my great bugbears is procurement. I know that the Public Accounts Committee in the Northern Ireland Assembly considered your Northern Ireland Audit Office 2023 Northern Ireland Public Procurement Report. We know that public sector bodies are responsible for the awarding of contracts per annum worth 2 to 4 billion. That's a huge amount of money. And that's a significant amount of money within the block. I personally was shocked to learn that the committee came to the conclusion that there is no one specific public procurement policy in Northern Ireland that helps, in their words, meet Northern Ireland public procurement objectives. That doesn't sit well with me at all. And actually, I'm not sure how we're expecting departments in Northern Ireland to go about the job of transformation if we can't even get this most basic premise right. It's almost as if we're penny wise and pound foolish. And I'm not asking you to comment on that because that's a political statement, that's my job. But for me, between that, the fact that we have a system of government that enables not only a system of constant collapse, and I'll pick up on another colleague's point about does it reward they didn't use the word bad behaviour. Does it reward bad behaviour in my opinion? Yes, it absolutely does. And these globs of money, as we've talked about throughout the morning, are not specific, are not overarching in nature, are not long term, and therefore ultimately we're chasing our tail, and it's the people in Northern Ireland that are losing out, and we're not seeing that anywhere clearer at the minute than our hospitals across the north. So for me, are there any concerns around public procurement in Northern Ireland as it stands at the minute? And if so, how does that relate to the overall job and task of transformation?
Let me start because so we did, as you mentioned, Saoirse, we published a report on procurement, and a bit like yourself, when we come in to look at this space, there are lots of every organisation is procuring. You know, it is fundamental. There's a lot of money spent in this area, and when we come in to scope it where we could make, I suppose, most impact in our work, the absence at that high strategic level, it ended up being a very strategic report, because the starting point where I usually go to look for things really wasn't there, and I was quite surprised by that as well. So you will see some of the recommendations in our report is about getting that strategic picture right, and then obviously seeing that the mechanisms, the processes will flow underneath it. When the Public Accounts Committee then held their inquiry on it as well, you'll see that one of the evidence that they were receiving was that, and there is a lot of good being done in procurement as well, and I think we tried to bring that out in our report, but large-scale repeated procurement failures have really led to a dissatisfaction in the system as well, which has played its part. The Public Accounts Committee remained unconvinced that the current structures, although they were hearing evidence from their witnesses that the structures were sound, they said in their report they remained unconvinced that the structures were right, and they have called on for some very time-bound responses to that. Certainly the members on that committee displayed real unease coming from constituents, coming from maybe an over-centralisation of process in some areas as well. So they've really asked for some quite fundamental reviews in that area, because it is an area where we can potentially make a lot of impact. So the process then from the Public Accounts Committees, and forgive me if I'm telling you something you already know, but the department are required to respond officially to those recommendations. So they're probably due now very soon, actually probably in the next month. So we will see how the Department of Finance would be the lead department there, but it is a very cross-cutting area. We have 9 COPs in place in Northern Ireland, and one of the things our report drew out is they're not all working collectively. When you go back into procurement policy, then it's only applying to central government, for example, or local government partners aren't required. So there is a disparate system at the minute, and certainly the Public Accounts Committee we're trying to really make recommendations to drive forward positive change in that way. So we will see, and they will then follow up on those recommendations once they get the response back.
Okay. Yeah.
Can I just say thank you? I've got to run to a meeting, but it's very nice to see you, and thanks for your answers.
Okay.
Thanks, Chair.
Right, no problem. Chris.
Thank you, everyone. As you probably saw, I was scribbling away, crossing out every follow-up question I had to my initial question. But thank you. It's been very interesting, and the answers have been very fulsome. We've talked a lot about cliff edges. We've talked a lot about the hopeful fact that multi-year budgets now will give more certainty and the ability to plan long term, which is excellent. All of us from local government greatly appreciate that. So I can only imagine what it's been like for the executive in Northern Ireland moving forwards. But with such minimal fundraising powers that the executive have, how does the executive, what sort of, you've touched on the political ramifications of such decision making, but at some stage, if you want to keep some of the I think they're called super parity measures that you have, which I would defend many of those that are in place right now. How is that going to balance up? How is it inevitable the executive are going to have to start making some tough decisions on raising funds moving forwards?
I suppose I'll kick off in that regard. Obviously, yes, there's a lot of pressure building. Clearly, the view of the Treasury is Northern Ireland should be doing more on revenue raising. I think there's a tacit acknowledgement of that across most political parties and the executive that they need to be inching into that territory. The counterpoint that's often raised to that is, with the cost of living crisis, that people will push back and say that in the context of pressures on households, imposing some of these measures will make life very, very difficult for a lot of households, so don't do it at this particular point in time. And I think Lisa Wilson was maybe due to be with us at one stage, but these issues here would say that if you factor in the issue of relative need, the scale of that superpriority may well be challenged to a certain extent in practice. But in practice, yes, that gap will have to be closed to a certain extent, because it is one of the levers the executive has in terms of the sustainability budgets going forward, and they will have to look at doing some of those. Though it is notable that they have officially ruled out some of the measures at this stage, in terms of some of the statements that ministers have made. So the field for those has been potentially narrowed. But I suppose the wider point you make as well is just in terms of incentivising the executive to do things differently. So the executive is very dependent on the block grant. It's almost like 95% of their resource comes from that. So revenue raising is a very small element in that particular regard. But there's also an issue too that, especially with some of the taxes being raised on a wider UK level, even if we saw a massive improvement in terms of the economy, the executive would not necessarily see the benefits from that. So we don't end up in a situation where we saw real increase in growth and economic output in Northern Ireland. That in itself would not feed through to the level of the block grant. So that's a dyssynergy that has emerged, and that may lead the executive not necessarily to do investments in the economy. It may make it more of a public service manager rather than trying to manage things. So that's perhaps a wider conversation that needs to be opened up around the economic levers that are available to Northern Ireland.
I think from my perspective, I don't get involved in the revenue raising debate. It's outside of my remit. But one of the roles that our office plays, and it's the stereotypical accountant. And if you like, there's always two ways to look at balancing the books. There's raising more money and there's cutting costs. And certainly the role of our office is to keep reminding people: are you doing things as efficiently as possible? Can you be doing more to deliver services efficiently? And going back to some of my comments at the start, departments haven't been able to think. They've been so busy firefighting, they have had difficulty, of recent years. The transformation funding is one lever and one opportunity, but certainly through our work we're constantly asking the question, can that service be delivered more efficiently? And we shouldn't forget about that side of things either.
There's a couple of observations, one of which, as you say, super parity, when you make a choice to be more generous in some areas of policy, then that is creating costs that are competing against other priorities. But it's a perfectly legitimate thing to want to choose within the overall funding pot you have available as to, where you want to devote the relative resources. On revenue raising, clearly one possibility is that you have greater devolution of tax raising powers along the lines of Scotland and Wales. That gives you greater opportunity to choose to raise more money and to use the tax system to try to influence people's behaviour in different sorts of ways, or to be more or less redistributive. Point I would make there is that is not without risk. You've seen a sort of different experience across Scotland and Wales where, in a sense, because of the way in which the block grant is adjusted, Scotland has had to raise taxes to stand still to a degree which hasn't been faced in Wales in the same way. So you're taking a bit of a gamble on the robustness of your revenue and whether you might actually need to start raising rates just to be where you are to begin with. In terms of the sort of pressures and the challenges on households, it might just be worth sort of focusing briefly on water, where you're you have a regulatory process that's basically, you have the utility regulator, the Department for Infrastructure, and NI Water all together. Ultimately, the utility regulator makes a decision, but it's got to be a collective discussion because it has to be affordable within the executive's budget. The last, what's called a price control, the period over which there's an agreement on what NI Water can spend and what it can charge, etc., was based on the idea that you would keep charges constant in real terms. Now that means constant in the sense of non-domestic water consumers actually paying a charge and domestic consumers not paying the charge. Instead, the Department for Infrastructure essentially provides a subsidy to NI Water to compensate for households not paying the charge. There's obviously, and has been for some time, big debate about whether you need to have more investments in the water area. There's issues around performance of the company and the delivery to existing customers, but the broader debate about whether you need more investment in infrastructure to be able to support wider residential and commercial property development, which will be good for economic growth. Now, I think quite interestingly, Dorinnia's and colleagues produced a report which recognised from some of the work that the utility regulator had done that the performance of Northern Ireland Water across different mechanisms has improved significantly. Its operational efficiency relative to the best companies in England and Wales has improved over time. So you might say, well, on performance grounds, leaving aside the development constraints, maybe you don't need to shove an enormous amount of more money in here in terms of relative performance. But at the end of last year, Ofwat said that the performance of the water companies in England and Wales wasn't good enough and has basically sanctioned them to increase charges by 20 to 50% in real terms over the next 5 years, presumably on the basis that that will fund investment that can improve, both sewerage and water provision performance. How does the executive think about what Northern Ireland Water can do in response to that? Because they're not, I would imagine, going to be terribly keen on seeing that sort of increase in non-domestic bills, and it would be very difficult for DFI to find the money to have the subsidy that would cover what would be a really big increase in domestic charging as well. So it's one area where you can point to a particular area where essentially through a different model, because these are private and in the case of Welsh Water, mutual companies, but they're charging their consumers more to put more money in. In Northern Ireland, you have a publicly owned water company that gets 20% of its money from non-domestic charges and 70% of it from a subsidy that comes out of the executive's pot. It's another bit of the super parity that now would, on the face of it, over the next 5 years, it looks harder for NI Water to be able to match the sort of increase in investment that the the Ofwat clearly thinks is necessary in England and Wales. So that's just a micro example of some of those challenges.
Thank you.
Okay, Claire.
Again, we've touched on it, but just once more for the tape. What progress has the Joint Exchequer Commission made on the final fiscal framework, and what should it contain? Stephen, sorry.
I don't think we have a timescale for this. There are various elements to it, one of which is sort of nailing down how the 124 mechanism will work. So that might well be tied down to issues like how you actually define the premium. As I say, how do you adjust this for the fact that you've got agriculture moving into the baseline? How do you deal with the cliff edge? So I think in terms of its impact on the funding for public services in Northern Ireland, those are the key elements. Clearly within that would be the possibility of revisiting the devolution of tax and spending powers. Obviously you had our near namesake, the NI Fiscal Commission under Paul Johnson, made some recommendations in that space, but as I say, that would present both opportunity and risk. I don't see a great appetite to go charging down that particular pathway. So I suspect much of the focus would be on the medium term, what you get out of the medium term financial position. But there's also the sort of long term fate of the Transformation Board and issues like that. But I haven't heard a date by
do
which
you get a sense that there's much going on? Because again, there's a lot of chat, and
I think, as Stephen's made the point, I think you really need, ideally, to get something in place by the time the next spending review is reaching conclusions, and a block grant settlement for 25-26. 26-27 onwards.
So yeah, I mean we're facing a fairly tight timescale in that particular regard. So these discussions will need to be bottomed out over the next number of months. And insofar as people have been seeking that independent advice around the 124, there has been communicated a sense of urgency around this need to be done over a fairly quick time frame. And I think the executive did well to get the interim fiscal framework in place quite speedily after restoration. I think that was one of the very positive outcomes, but more work remains to be done, and having this structure in place is obviously beneficial as a more formal means of communication around these issues. Of course, there's always channels that happened prior to that, but it does create a structured agenda over issues to be addressed. I suppose the issue is to what extent we can widen this out to maybe talk about transformation in a longer term time frame and on a greater scale.
Okay, thank you. I'm just going to end with a few questions on the impact of the autumn budget, and just if you have already spoken about this, just you can keep your your responses brief. But what, in your opinion, is going to be the impact on public service delivery for the autumn? Of the autumn budget's approximately 19 billion allocation to Northern Ireland in 25-26. Stephen.
Well, on the surface, the 19 billion figure is very impressive and probably exceeded the expectations that people had as to where that was going to land. So I think there's a sense that this will provide greater headroom to manage the firefighting pressures that Northern Ireland's on. I don't think it's big enough to get us out of this trap that we are constantly in firefighting mode. So it may not be a game changer in that regard. If we bear in mind that the bulk of the warrant consequentials in year weren't sufficient to even pay off the overspend, and then you factor in other aspects of the budget, not least the employers' national insurance requirement, public sector pay, other inescapable pressures, it's not in a sense going to balance the books for Northern Ireland. So,
does it help begin the process of public service reform?
I think it may create a little bit more breathing space, but I don't think it's big enough, Chair, to have that change. We need to move from essentially a burning platform to try to do this, and I'm not sure where it's at a level to get us away from that particular context. And I go to the point I made at the very start. In England and elsewhere, the effect of that additional UK-wide budget in terms of the big increase in spending will in due course be seen in terms of improved outcomes in terms of public services. That may not necessarily be the case in Northern Ireland due to the wider pressures that are being faced, and that may end up in a situation where the gap in performance measures between Northern Ireland and the rest of the UK widens in the short to medium term.
Dorinnia, have you made any assessment of the budget?
No, from my perspective, I almost have to reserve judgment until I see how departments then, perform against their allocations in terms of the block grant. The one thing I suppose I would note at this point is certainly in the context of the pressures that are being faced, in the context of the agreements that have been made with Treasury, I'm not hearing a sense from departments, it's not euphoric, let's say. There's still pressures ongoing, and I would still anticipate seeing the outworkings of those pressures throughout our work, certainly in the short to medium term.
Mr. Robert, do you have a comment?
Well, I mean, the headline impact is there's 640 million more for 2024-25 and 1.5 billion more in Barnett consequentials for 25-26. So of the 24-25, the vast bulk, about 85% of that, not surprisingly, has gone to health and education. As Stephen said, it has helped us whittle down the prospective overspend from more than 800 to less than 150. Pay obviously being a key part of the pressure that's been faced in the near term. The additional 1.5 billion for 2025-26. If you look at the resource, that's the day-to-day spending overall. That's a 1.3% real increase. So better than flat relative to inflation, but clearly lots of pressures, and so by no means unstraightforward. As I think we mentioned before, on the resource side, it's infrastructure, justice that have probably seen the biggest increases relative to what they had been planning to get in 24-25, so they're the relative winners on the resource side. On the capital side, it's communities and education, so the jumps from 24-25 for communities, it's social housing. For education, I think it's the Stroul campus that's seeing the additional money there. Substantive additions to resources there. Also, the executive taking full advantage of the limited borrowing powers that it has on the capital side as well, which is beneficial there. I think the point you come back to, though, is that all the narrative at the UK budget level is that this was a big increase in spending, partly paid for by tax, partly paid for by borrowing. But certainly the message to Whitehall departments is don't think there are further big jumps coming in the next spending review over the coming years. It's more a question of, we've seen a step change here. You should be thinking about living with that. We'll wait obviously to see what comes with the spending review and further statement in the spring. So that increase clearly welcome, bigger than the executive has expected, but it's not starting a trajectory of much bigger real increases stretching as far as the eye can see.
Okay, so my last question, if you can answer it, please do. I'll start with you, Stephen. Is the Northern Ireland office itself receiving enough funding to allow it to support the Northern Ireland executive?
Probably more or less okay. I think it's important to recognise that the NIO is funded perhaps at a greater level than the Scottish and Welsh office would be in comparative terms, but equally the NIO probably is dealing with a broader range of challenges than their equivalents would be, and obviously at the moment a lot of the legacy issues are eating up a lot of time in terms of the civil service and ministers, and in essence there's three issues in terms of the NIO narrative at this stage. I'm sure the committee is very familiar with this. Is essentially legacy, issues around winter framework implementation, and essentially public services are basically the three big ticket issues on the agenda for the Secretary of State.
Okay, Dorinnia.
I'm afraid I can't offer any comment. The NIO sits under the remit of the National Audit Office, so not something I'm familiar with, so apologies, Chair.
Oh, no, that's fine. And Robert?
Well, I'm sure Julie Harrison would wish me to say that she could do a lot more with a lot more money. No, I have no particular insight into whether they're adequately funded or not. I mean, clearly one of the differences with the other territorial offices is that periodically the NIO has to step in for the executive when the institutions are not functioning. That's not an issue that the others have to confront, and it obviously complicates the fact that you need to be, bluntly, you need to be ready to do that if you have to, in the way in which the others don't.
Well, can I thank you all for your time today, and I'll call order.